So if people don't start complying or the courts don't stop this, we're in for a real disaster at the end of the year. I don't know what a better term is for it. And so that's why we're looking for court action now.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. NFIB and our members advocate to keep America's small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
Welcome to the Small Business Rundown, a biweekly podcast with information on independent businesses, victories, and challenges in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. This is Adam Temple, and I'm NFIB's Senior Vice President of Advocacy. A new small business registry rule known as beneficial ownership went into effect on January 1st of this year. As it stands now, small businesses need to report their beneficial owners to the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, by the end of this year. NFIB and our small business owners have been fighting to stop the new rule and are continuing to push for it to be repealed in Congress, which has proven to be a continuous challenge. But today we're talking with NFIB's Small Business Legal Center Executive Director Beth Milito and Caleb Kruckenberg, an attorney in a district court case that's challenging this law. The case is known as Texas Top Cop Shop versus Merrick Garland. Beth and Caleb, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us,
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here. Beth, we'll start with you. It's not your first rodeo. You've been on before talking about this topic. So can you start by giving us a brief explanation of the new small business registry, otherwise known as the beneficial ownership reporting requirement?
Yes, Adam. So the beneficial ownership reporting requirement, or I call it the small business registry, came about as part of the Corporate Transparency Act, which took effect on January 1st, 2024. And this law mandates that small businesses report beneficial ownership information to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The law requires companies to disclose information about individuals who own or control 25% or more of the business. And small businesses should be aware that the Corporate Transparency Act applies to most entities with fewer than 20 employees or less than $5 million in revenue. So what this means, Adam, is that over 30 million small businesses are affected by this law.
And I mentioned earlier that NFIB fought the law when it was proposed. It was ultimately passed. We're now supporting a repeal of the law. But how did NFIB decide to get involved on the legal side related to it?
That's a great question, Adam, and I'm glad you brought up NFIB's advocacy against the Corporate Transparency Act. We were one of the few business groups, if not the only business group, that was really pushing back and opposed to the Corporate Transparency Act because of the impact it would have and the burden it would have on small businesses. So we have been leading an effort to repeal, as you said, the Corporate Transparency Act. But as we often do at NFIB, we look at other ways to fight back against burdensome laws and regulations. And often that means going to court. And that's exactly what we've done here. While we have this repeal effort on Capitol Hill and Congress going on, at the same time, too, we turn to the courts to look at ways that we could challenge it there. And that's where we've partnered up with the Center for Individual Rights and have filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the law.
And that's where Caleb comes in. Caleb, can you tell us a little bit about your role in this case and give us some context on the district court case that's currently taking place in Texas?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think part of the way I have to think about the Corporate Transparency Act and the registry is how it works. And so basically what the law says is if you have a business entity, and it doesn't really matter what kind, it's a corporation, a partnership, whatever, the fact that you registered it with a state Secretary of State, so like you registered your corporation, that triggers this new federal requirement that you then file beneficial ownership reports with the Department of Treasury, and they have to be filed every year. And part of the problem with that is the federal government has to be able to do that in the first place. They have to have the power to say, once you've filed paperwork with the state, suddenly we as the federal government have the extra power to make you file these additional pieces of paper. And the fact is they just don't. So this is something that I have been watching for a while. And then, when we realized the law's effect on the small business community and its complete lack of constitutional authority, we jumped in. And I think we wanted to file suit as soon as we possibly could.
And what are the main points of the lawsuit?
So there's only 3 reasons that we think that this law is unconstitutional, other than just being a really bad idea.
Okay.
And being a bad idea is good if you're challenging a law, but it doesn't usually get you there legally. the federal government has to do is they have to say, we have the constitutional power to do this. And what they're claiming is this is their power over interstate commerce. So the ability of people to engage in business between the states. That is a federal interest. But here, the federal law happens, it gets triggered when a state business incorporates under state law. And there's no interstate element to it. And that might seem kind of technical, but that is about the separation of the federal government, the limited federal government, and state governments that are supposed to do this kind of normal regulation of businesses. And really just at a very basic level, this is the federal government going too far when it doesn't have the power. There are also, though, First Amendment and Fourth Amendment concerns. And the Fourth Amendment is pretty easy. That is your right, your protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. And here we have a federal agency that is stated goal is law enforcement. It's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They're looking for something you did, and they're making you file information that they didn't have so they can look through it just in case you committed a crime. That's exactly the kind of thing that the Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect against. And then there's also a First Amendment problem, because this applies to nonprofits. It applies to political parties. One of our clients is a local political party, and they have to disclose who's funding them, who they're associated with. And you actually have a First Amendment right to not identify yourself as an organization or as a funder of an organization when you say things politically or when you engage in speech. And this law violates that right. And so if we start it's a bad idea, but it's also unconstitutional. So I think the choice for us to sue is very easy.
Yeah. And if the law doesn't get repealed, do you see an uptick in cases like this?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons we're talking about beneficial ownership now is the law was passed several years ago. Mm-hmm. And the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network said, we're not going to start enforcing it till January 1st of 2025. Well, that seemed a long way off years ago, but it's coming up. And as people know in the small business community, you have till the end of the year to file these reports. The federal government has said, if you don't file the report before the end of the year, you're a federal criminal. You're a felon, and we'll start enforcing it. And there are at least 30 million small businesses nationwide who are affected by this rule. That's according to the U.S. Treasury. Mm-hmm. So if people don't start complying or the courts don't stop this, we're in for a real disaster at the end of the year. I don't know what a better term is for it. And so that's why we're looking for court action now.
Yeah, and what we'll definitely have is the government accusing a lot more law-abiding small business owners of being criminals. Beth, what are the penalties for small business owners that don't comply by the end of the year?
The penalties are pretty frightening. Failure to provide a completed and updated report, because as Caleb mentioned too, there can be an obligation to update your reports. Failure to do so can result in criminal penalties of up to 2 years in prison and civil penalties of up to $500 per day for every day that you were out of compliance. So it can be very, very significant. NFIB did a survey at the beginning of the year, and 83% of small business owners were not aware of this reporting obligation, which is pretty frightening. At NFIB, we're doing our best to raise awareness, but the court really needs to stop this before the end of the year.
Beth, what do listeners need to know about the Repealing Big Brother Overreach Act?
Adam, this is a bill that's pending right now in Congress, which NFIB has been advocating for. It would overturn the Corporate Transparency Act. And we encourage listeners out there who are interested in sharing their voice to check out the link in the show notes there, which will take them to an alert page so they can share their concerns about this overreach and support for the Repealing Big Brother Overreach Act.
And you mentioned that a lot of them don't know about it. I guess this question could be for either of you. When you talk to small business owners, I know you do, Beth, and Caleb, I assume you do as well, and they're informed about this, what is the general reaction or response that you hear from folks?
Outrage, I think, is probably the most common expression. Like, what do you mean I have to send all this information in? And then when they get to the part about how you have to include a picture of your driver's license and passport and upload this into a database that who knows who has access to. And you could probably speak more towards maybe, Caleb, the privacy concerns. I mean, it really is just outrage and disbelief.
Yeah. The most common reaction I have when I tell anybody about this is, wait, what? What is this? And because it's escaped a lot of notice, but it affects so many people. I mean, it affects me personally in the sense that I have a professional corporation that I own, as many lawyers do, which is part of my professional practice as an attorney. And this thing applies every state, every small business, and nobody has a clue. And so I think we have an enforcement problem coming up because if, at the end of the year, we have tens of millions of people who are likely out of compliance, I expect Treasury is going to start filing enforcement cases. That's how they're going to try to notify people. And, as Beth said, this is really invasive stuff. This is not just my name and address. This is anybody with a connection to my business. I have to have a current photo ID of them with their current home address. And if I make an error or an omission or something changes and I don't update it, I'm out of compliance. Mm-hmm. So it is shocking. And it is shocking how poorly it has been explained to the American people and how few people even are aware of it.
And that's why we're trying to tackle it on both fronts. So we'll continue to follow this case. Caleb, we appreciate the work that you're putting into it on small business owners' behalf. But before we go, is there anything else you'd like to add about the case or the issue in general?
So we have a hearing in our case. It is scheduled currently for October 9th in the U.S. District Court on a preliminary injunction. And we've asked the court to stop the rule for NFIB's members. And we are optimistic. Obviously, we filed this case because we think we're right. We think there's no defense, and we're hopeful. But I mean, look, we'll take this case all the way to the Supreme Court if we need to. And one way or the other, we have to stop this. And I hope we're the ones that do it.
Anything from you, Beth?
I just would like to close out by thanking Caleb and the Center for Individual Rights for their legal advocacy on behalf of NFIB and its members. And Adam, I want to shout out to the federal government relations team here at NFIB for their work fighting to get this repealed on the Hill there, too. As you said, we're fighting this here at NFIB on multiple fronts.
Absolutely. I think that's a good place to leave it. Caleb, I appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
If you are a small business owner, please consider taking a few minutes to follow the link in today's show notes to add your voice to the fight to repeal this rule. You'll also find links to the NFIB Small Business Legal Center's Beneficial Ownership Reporting Requirement Fact Sheet and more information on this issue. NFIB will continue to advocate for the repeal of this reporting requirement and will keep small business owners updated with any kind of changes. Looking ahead, if you've got a question or there's anything you'd like us to cover on a future episode of the podcast, please send us an email to podcast@nfib.org. And now I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on today's Small Business Rundown. We'll be back every 2 weeks bringing you news and analysis from Washington, D.C. and state capitals so that you, whether you're a small business owner or a supporter of one, can continue to blaze a trail.
The Small Business Rundown is brought to you by NFIB, the voice of small business. You can find us at nfib.com and on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.